activity code and result code. So switching back over here. Okay, so that's just the context of what we're looking at here. The first thing that I want to talk about is a number of things on grouping features. So I'm going to pull in a field here that allows me to do some grouping here. So this is a pretty standard field. Of course, everybody's got in history this user ID field. And what I'm going to talk about first is grouping and how grouping gets passed between different tabs. Let's start this by, I'm going to make a clone of this. So I've got 2 copies of the same report here. And you probably know in working with MasterMine up until now that if you go and make a group of, I'm going to go ahead and do this using the regular Excel grouping built into the short menu. If you make a group like that in a workbook that has multiple copies of the same pivot table, that group actually does get passed through to the other tab. So you see when I switch back over to original, that group is there just as it was on original 2. I'm switching between the 2 tabs here. However, if I rename this group, and this is my East Coast users, and these are my West Coast users, make a group out of those. The new label that I put on there does not apply where the pivot table is just copied on those other tabs. So if you wanted that same label to pass through to all the reports in the workbook, you would have to go sheet by sheet and remember that this is my East Coast ones, that's my West Coast ones. And it's easy enough when there are 2 of them, a little bit harder when there are, a dozen different subgroups that you're making. So in this new version, what I've done is something a little more convenient. Namely, if you make that group, and let's say this is going to be our East Coast group, I highlight those and make my group now using the MasterMine grouping, I get a naming dialog. And this not only informs me as a user that I can set a name for that group, any name that I want to, put in East Coast here, but it also by default applies this group name across all the similar pivot tables in the same workbook. So now when I say OK, that's the name on both tabs. And I'll go here and call this Central, and this is my West Coast. Actually, you know what? I'm going to leave West Coast not selected, or leave that. So I left it with the same name, but I'm going to ungroup that because I want to make a point here. Okay, so those 2 are still the same. Now, one thing that people have asked for a long time is, what happens when I've forgotten? I wanted to add somebody to a group and I didn't have them in there already, or I didn't have them selected when I made my group. So up until now, of course, what you've needed to do is highlight all the ones that are in the group already and Control-click on the new one to add them to that group, and then that would add them in. Now, I've actually added something that's a little more convenient, maybe a little more intuitive, which is I hit Ryan in a report that already has groupings like this. So now when I hit the grouping button, hello. Okay, I don't know. It should happen either one of those that I'm in, so I'll have to look at that. But in this case, and this is actually the one that's a little bit more intuitive for people, if I select Ryan in the same column with the other groups that I want to make, it detects that, okay, there are groups already there, and it allows me to pick among my existing groups to add that one to. So I'll put Ryan in East Coast, and again, apply this group name across all the similar pivot tables. And so now Ryan has been joined into the East Coast group there, and you can see also on tab 1, or on the first tab, he's in there. So adding to an existing group now is much more easy. And that's especially important because, you create a group and then later on a new user joins the company. You want them to be in that group, and if you didn't know the trick for adding somebody to the user to that group already, that person would just wind up on the bottom of the list here. And for a lot of users, they're just sort of stuck. They didn't know how to get that person into an existing group. So that's adding to an existing group. I think that's it on the grouping part. In the what we call the info box, the dialog that I've put quite a lot of work into